Morning, Kristen. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you so much for being here. As part of One Book, One Coast, the largest West Coast book club initiative running April 1st through May 31st, 2026, more than 100 libraries across California, Washington, and Oregon are coming together to read They Call Us Enemy by George Takei. And we're so excited because this program is all about building community through shared reading and reflection, and it will culminate in a virtual conversation with George on May 31st. To help us deepen our understanding of the history behind the book and why it still matters today, I'm joined by Kristen Hayashi, Director of Collections Management and Access and Curator at the Japanese American National Museum, where she oversees the permanent collection and curates content through exhibitions and public programs. In addition to her work in museums, Kristen is also involved in historic preservation work and has authored several historic cultural monument nominations for sites in Los Angeles. Kristen earned a Ph.D. in history from the University of California, Riverside, and her dissertation research examined the return and resettlement of Japanese Americans to Los Angeles in early post-World War II period. Kristen, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with me today. I'm so excited to meet you. Can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself, your generation as a Japanese American?
Sure, yeah. Well, I identify as being Japanese American or Nikkei, which means I'm of Japanese descent. And I also identify as being Yonsei, which in Japanese translates to fourth generation. So this is kind of like a way that, Japanese Americans sort of identify themselves as by generation. So Yonsei or fourth generation means that my great grandparents were first generation and they came as immigrants from Japan. And then my grandparents were born here in the United States. They would be called Nisei. Their immigrant parents, Issei, first generation. My parents identify as being Sansei or third generation. And then I am Yonsei.
Nice. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's such a pleasure to meet with you. And I'm noticing something in your background. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is before we get into the book?
Sure. This is an illustration by Mineo Kubo, and she was from Riverside, California, and she was the first former incarceree to publish a book-length memoir on the incarceration experience, and it was a graphic memoir, and so it really reminds me of They Called Us Enemy. This is, another graphic memoir, but hers was the first, and it was published in 1946, and it was nearly 200 illustrations that chronicled her experience while she was incarcerated during World War II, accompanied by captions that helps to describe her experience as well. And so
Wow.
we have her collection. We have all the illustrations that she created while she was incarcerated at Tan Fran Temporary Detention Center in Northern California, and then Topaz concentration camp in Utah.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's interesting to know that this story has been shared before, and especially in an earlier time through graphic novel. So this is my first experience with this story. And I really enjoyed reading the book and especially experiencing it as a graphic novel. I was able to read it in one sitting. And I also was able to share it with my young son who's 6 years old.
Oh, wow. Yeah, so
Yeah,
your son would have been around the same age as George Takei was when he and his family were forced to leave their home in Los Angeles.
exactly. Yes. And my son just was like, wow, mommy, I can't believe that happened to, him and his family. Like he couldn't imagine. And so we got to a few pages, but it was really nice to share that experience with him because one of the things I like to teach my son is that the world is so much bigger than what we see around us, and so many people have different kinds of experiences. And so I want to open up by asking you a few questions. And my opening question is, sometimes we read about history in a book and it can feel distant. How do
Mhm.
you think books like They Call Us Enemy help bring this history to life for readers today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that is a reason why some people say that they don't like history is because it feels so long ago and about people that they can't really connect to. And I think you're right. I think that George Takei's graphic memoir, They Called Us Enemy, is completely opposite of that. And partly, I think because it is a graphic memoir, and so I think it kind of it reads like a comic in some ways, and so I think that draws you in and makes it seem more accessible. And then it's you're taken along, and George talks about his entire life from his childhood to his adulthood to the present day. And I think that, again, it's really accessible and draws you in. And so it helps make, history seem a lot more relevant because you can relate to George's experience.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that the illustrations, it just brings everything to life. Um, and although I felt really drawn in and attached to this childhood perspective that the book,
Mm.
has because he's thinking about this and reflecting about this from his 6-year-old self. And so the book tells this story through a child's eyes. And I'm curious to know from your perspective, at the Japanese American National Museum, how important is it to preserve and share these childhood memories as part of the historical record?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that what George does really well is he talks about his experience being 5 or 6 years old, and in some ways it was like an adventure for him, right? That he was in this new place and was exploring. He talks about like how one of the other children talked about how dinosaurs were sort of, in that place before, and it really gets his imagination going. He talks kind of at times about, just being a child and having fun. But he is also very clear to say that now as an adult, he looks back and you realize that the trauma that he experienced as a child has stayed with him his whole life. But I think it does show that the experience was different depending on age, and you see that through the difference in the way he experienced camp as a 5-year-old versus how his parents experienced camp. And he talks about how his parents really tried to shield their children from just the trauma of the situation, how abnormal the situation was. Um, but I think that by like through George's experience, I think it shows that he was a child, and it starts to make you question like why would an innocent child like this have to go through an injustice like this? It just I think conjures that up.
Yeah, it really does. I think that what I love most, though, about the story, and seeing it through a child's eyes is the innocence of childhood. And even in traumatic experiences, children are still going to get to experience the world as best they can from that viewpoint. And one of the things that I noticed about the storyline is that Christmas came a few times throughout the book. But
That's right.
it brought like a sense of like it to me it seemed like Christmas was a comfort zone, and something that felt like a moment where we can just be free in
Right.
spite of all of the challenges that are being experienced in that moment.
That is true. He talks about how those Christmas memories are just so vivid for him and some of his favorite memories. But you can also tell that he picked up on things, right? That I think one Christmas his father he was without his was that right? Where he was without his father. But I mean, you could just tell that he picked up on certain things. So while it's a good memory, he also realized where they were and what they were without. And so yeah, it shows that kids understand what's happening around them. Um, yeah.
Indeed. No, go for it. Did you have something that you were thinking?
No, no, yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
okay. For for those who may be new to this history, can you briefly explain why Japanese Americans were forcibly removed and incarcerated during World War II and what the country later acknowledged about those decisions that were made?
Right. Well, so in George Takei's graphic memoir, it sort of starts right in 1941, right, with Pearl Harbor, and then early 1942 with the actions that are taken right after. And while it's true that Pearl Harbor, had a profound impact on the Japanese American community, I think that sort of taking a step back, it's really important to show that, this was this long trajectory of discrimination and prejudice towards immigrants, towards Japanese Americans specifically. And it wasn't just Pearl Harbor that caused the mass removal and incarceration, that it's part of this longer history of discrimination and prejudice and racism and wartime hysteria and a failure of political leadership. And those are the reasons for the incarceration that came out many years later, when this was being sort of examined to understand why the mass removal and incarceration happened. But I think at the time, in 41, 42, like there was just a lot of wartime hysteria and again, the prejudice and racism that led to these actions. Even though the United States was at war with Japan, they were also at war with Germany and Italy too. And those immigrant populations that were here in the United States weren't impacted in the same way, or as profoundly as Japanese Americans. So it shows that there was a difference there in how Japanese Americans were treated in comparison to these other communities.
Yeah, indeed. One of the things that I feel like really gave me a warm, fuzzy feeling, but also like a sense of security and relatability, that it's okay to talk to children about the things that are happening in the world around them at a level in which they're able to understand. But by doing so, it helps to build confidence in those children. And I think one of the most powerful elements of the book is when George Takei's father exhibits dignity and he expresses honesty to his children and his profound belief in democracy, even after all of the injustice that his family experienced. And so, in your work, how often do you see stories of leadership and resilience that emerge from families who experienced incarceration?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great question because I think that this book examines this in so many different ways. So one, I do think that, while during World War II, while George and his siblings were children, maybe his parents, didn't talk to them so directly. They, did try to shield them a little bit from what was happening around them. But, throughout the graphic memoir, George, kind of in these flashbacks, talks about these discussions that he had with his father as like an adult, a young adult, and had a lot of questions for his father. He didn't really understand like why his father wasn't more resilient, or why he allowed for their family to even go to camp, like why they didn't just resist. And father and son had this dialogue, and I think that's actually kind of unusual. And it was really nice to see that because I think that more commonly, people didn't talk about the camp experience. Like there was a lot of shame. And George talks about how he was sort of disappointed in some ways in his father at the time, but now reflecting back, he realizes how his father really had this leadership role, and both of his parents really took these roles of resilience during World War II. He has this great line about how everything his mother did was her own statement of defiance, and he talks about that when she brought the sewing machine into camp as one of the few possessions that she brought with her, but it was a way to sort of make an abnormal situation as normal as possible, to try to make their surroundings, feel more comfortable. And so she, made those curtains and did whatever she could to try to protect her family, her children. George's father took on those roles of leadership. He was a block leader. He was, yeah, he was a representative, for the incarcerees at Roar and at Tule Lake, both the camps they were in, and really did stand up for social justice at a time when, even though it seemed like they had choices to make, there really was no choice. And we see that later on in the story when George's mother, has to make those really difficult decisions about, renunciation of citizenship and different ways that she could protect her family. But yeah, I think that is really important. And George, sees that over his life as he reflects on his parents' experience.
Yeah. I really enjoyed that part where, his mom was tugging along her bag and she didn't want anybody to touch it. And then finally she opens it and it's the sewing machine and his dad just looked and fell out laughing and they just laughed. It was like a moment where they felt like relief. And again, that sign of resistance. Like I still get to own me, and I think that sometimes when communities and people are torn apart from their identities, that self-determination rises up. And it's still a sense of like, no, I get to define me on my own terms. And even something as simple as a sewing machine was, like you said, an act of resistance. I wanted to go in a little bit about, because in his book, he doesn't really go too deeply into the No-No Boys and what that movement meant. And I wanted to find out if you can share a little bit about what that experience was and that those group of folks, that resistance. I recall reading it and thinking of, and although he didn't go deeply in it, I thought immediately as an African American person of the Black Panther Party. And so I wanted to see, being resistant and strong-minded and standing steadfast in what it is that you believed in. And I wanted to see if you could share a little bit more about the No-No Boys with us through your lens.
Sure. Um, so the mass removal of Japanese Americans from the West Coast and subsequent incarceration, was never meant, well, it was okay. The goal of this was to move the concentration of the population away from the West Coast and disperse it widely across the country. And so they did that by removing them and putting them into what we call America's concentration camps. Um, these camps were never meant to be permanent. So the idea was once you could prove your loyalty to the United States government and you had proof of employment and housing, you were able to leave. And that could happen pretty quickly. Um, uh, but again, it was sort of about testing loyalty. And this comes up a lot in, they called this enemy. But in 1943, the United States government issues a loyalty questionnaire to all adults. And, there are a number of questions that ask seemingly innocuous questions like, what magazines did you subscribe to? What organizations do you donate to? But there were two questions in particular that are infamous. They were poorly written, poorly thought through, and those are questions 27 and 28. And one essentially asked, would you be willing to serve in the armed forces? The other question asked, essentially, would you be willing to give up and sever all ties to Japan and the emperor? So, these are again very again, poorly written questions. And so in the case you're talking about No-No Boys, so there were some, well, around this time, there was a segregated U.S. Army unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team that was formed. And the idea was that Nisei, Japanese American men and women, could prove their loyalty by joining. And so they first asked for volunteers, and then later there was a draft. So this is all around the time that the loyalty questionnaire is being issued. And so there are people that said, wait a second, I would love to serve my country. However, my family, meantime, would still be incarcerated behind barbed wire. So I'm going to say no out of principle to that question of would I be willing to serve in the armed forces. And then that question of would you be willing to sever all ties with Japan and the emperor? So if you're a Nisei, Japanese American born here in the United States, US citizen by birth, you would say like, well, no, I don't have any ties to even to the emperor or the government of Japan. So I might be inclined to say no and no. And so those who said no and no, especially in terms of like you're talking about the no no boys, they were especially at places like Heart Mountain. The Heart Mountain Fair Play Committee is very well known because that was about 60, a little over 60 young men who said no and no to those questions. And they were convicted for evading the draft and sent to federal penitentiaries for doing that. And it wasn't because they didn't want to serve in the military, it was more out of principle because of just that difficulty of those questions, the fact that their family would still be incarcerated behind barbed wire. There was a like a really like a stigma attached to the no-no boys. They were seen as unpatriotic, as troublemakers, but many of them did it just out of principle. um, Similarly, this comes up in They Called Us Enemy because George's parents also said no and no to those questions for different reasons. And because they answered that way on the questionnaire, they were deemed disloyal and they were sent to Tule Lake, which became a segregation center. And because of the way they answered that questionnaire. So, if you had said no and no, or a combination of yes and no, or left it blank, you were deemed disloyal. And again, there was a stigma with people at the time within the Japanese American community, larger circles, as these were people who were disloyal. But I think that's really changing as people start to see that, they were standing up for principles, and in some ways that is just as democratic as saying, proving your loyalty, I guess, and saying yes and yes. And so, even though it seemed like there was choice, there really is no choice. There really, is no such thing as, there was definitely the only answer, and that was to say yes and yes, as you can see from what happened, to George's family.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much. The book draws connections between the incarceration of Japanese Americans and present day conversations about immigration and detention. What do you hope people take away from the history as they think about the moment that we're in today?
Right. Yeah. They say that um, that the past reverberates, right? It echoes, and I think you can really see that today. What it happened to George as George's family is, arguably happening, today. We see that there's this long trajectory of the way that immigrants have been treated in this country, the way that certain people have been otherized, and the way that people are vulnerable in this country. And I think about different things. I think about families being separated. I think about the way that immigrants have been seen, I guess seen as or criminalized or seen as criminals just because they are immigrants, or somehow identified as not being American enough. And I think that that is something that is very apparent today. And so there are these, connections between what happened during World War II to Japanese Americans and what's happening, present day all around us. And it's frightening. And George sort of ends talking about like the importance. He ends with a President Obama quote about the importance of like understanding the past to help us. Um, you know, uh, I guess make sense of the present and also um, improve the future. And so that's why that history is really important. And we see that even though, here at the Japanese American National Museum and other organizations, really try to tell this history as a way to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And so, it's just, frightening just to see that there's a lot of echoes today.
Yeah, so true. What role do you think libraries, community programming, and museums and programs through libraries like One Book, One Coast play in helping people engage with difficult histories like this one? And what do you hope readers carry with them after this experience is shared?
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of reflects George's story too. You know, he talks about when he was, I guess, in college or he was a student and he was trying to understand more about what happened to him as a child, trying to make sense of this, develop the context around it. And he was, you know, trying to read all these sources, and there was really he couldn't find a lot of sources that talked about this history during World War II and what happened to Japanese Americans. And so, you know, he was seeking out this knowledge, and you know, I think that that's why you know this program, One Book, One Coast, libraries in general, public programs, museums, like all the things that you're talking about are so important because you know it's making this history, it's making these narratives, these stories more accessible to a broad audience. I think that while they call this enemy, we were talking about how it's such an accessible lens into this history by it being on this platform, you know, really, I think introduces, exposes this history to a much broader audience, and that is so critical. This started, you know, for one library system in Southern California, and now it's like the book that was selected for libraries across the West Coast. And that's just incredibly exciting because, you know, I think we do really good work here at the Japanese American National Museum telling this history, but there's so many more people that we need to reach. And so that's why um, George's book, They Call This Enemy, is just like so important because I think that it is accessible and will really share this history with students, young people, adults alike who may have never known about this history.
Yeah, indeed. I can't wait to visit the Japanese American National Museum as well because I learned about it actually through Rick Noguchi, our president and CEO. But after reading this book, I'm like, well, I really want to step into the museum to see the artifacts, read the history, and connect more with the experiences that people had to endure as Japanese American. And I know for me, sometimes as a person who can, thinks in a self-centered way, I could get caught up in the idea that um, other people, other races, other ethnicities didn't have it as hard as African Americans or as people that were enslaved. But when I learn about this, and it's like we're more alike than we're not alike, and we all have a story to tell. And unfortunately, it's a story riddled in trauma and anguish. But by reading this book, and seeing it from a childlike perspective, it does something to me as a reader to say, we can rise, we can overcome. It's like, the song, the ritual, we can overcome someday. And having a museum and having these stories uplifted are so necessary because it's a memory that we don't want to forget as we move forward. And it's something that does inform us of how we show up today and how we acknowledge what's going around us today as well. Um,
Absolutely. I think that's so important. You know, I think that, you know, we really are trying to cultivate empathy and we tell this history, I think, through these personal narratives as a way so that people relate, so that people care and, you know, want to do something to stand up for people who are vulnerable. I think that that is a difference between 1942 and today. You know, 1942, very few people stood up for Japanese Americans. You do learn about a few people, some everyday people, including Herbert Nicholson, who was like getting books from Roman's library. That's what George talks about and delivering them. You know, it's those little acts where he didn't forget about his neighbors or the people from his community. Um, George also talks about the attorney from from the ACLU, Wayne Collins, who helped to prevent Japanese Americans from getting deported, from having to renounce their U.S. citizenship. But those are real. I mean, there's so few stories like that where I think that today um, people are showing up and they are really, more people are standing up for those who are vulnerable, immigrants, other people who have been targeted and are vulnerable. And so I think that is so important that we, just cultivate, yeah, empathy and realize that we do have more in common than, we are different, as you pointed out so poignantly.
Yeah, thank you. I want to leave with one final reflection question, and that's if there's one story or artifact you wish every American could encounter, what would it be and why?
That is such a great question. I have so many favorites like in my head. Gosh, this is in Janum's collection
Yeah.
that we have.
Yes.
Um, can I name a couple?
Oh, please do.
Well, one that we talk about so often is Stanley Hayami's diary. Stanley Hayami was a high school student when his world was really turned upside down and his family was forced to leave San Gabriel, California, which is here in the greater Los Angeles area. And while he was in high school at Heart Mountain concentration camp in Wyoming, he kept a diary and he illustrates daily life and also has these text entries. But there's this one particular drawing that he has that, really you get it immediately. He draws his family's home in San Gabriel, California from 1931 to 1942. And he draws his family's barracks, which is his temporary home at Heart Mountain, and that's in 1942. And he does this at the end of 1942. In 1943, he has just a big question mark because he doesn't know where his home is going to be. He doesn't know where he will be. And I think that really shows immediately just how, of course, this was unjust. Of course, their rights were taken away and all that. But just like, yeah, this uncertainty and how, terrifying that was to know or to not know like when one day you will have like your rights and your freedom restored, and this is a high school student like thinking about that. So Stanley Hayami's diary is one of them. I do think about Mineo Kubo's illustrations in our collection. She created thousands of these sketches while she was incarcerated during World War II because at first cameras were not allowed. They were considered contraband. And as an artist, she was like really set on documenting this experience and this injustice. And so, because cameras were not allowed, she got to work with her pen and pencil and paper and just started sketching everyday life. And so, in this illustration, this is Mine and her brother Toku, and you see they're with their belongings, and it says Okubo, their last name, and they're wearing these tags that say 13660, and it shows how they were U.S. citizens, but they were reduced to a number, and their rights were taken away. And this is about when they were removed from their community in California and then sent to, one of America's concentration camps. But there, just so many of these where they're everyday people who are, just, I don't know, I think we can relate to them as a result, but they help us to really understand just this experience, just like George did through his graphic memoir. And so, yeah, those are just some of the things because I think people can really relate to their experiences and yeah.
Indeed, indeed. Well, it has been such a pleasure to be in this conversation with you and for you to give us this historical lens, and you have so much to share. And I encourage everyone who is watching this conversation, if you haven't yet, to run out and order the book They Call Us Enemy by George Takei. Thank you for holding it up. This is part of the One Book, One Coast, the largest West Coast book club initiative running April 1st through May 31st of this year. Thank you so much, Kristen. I wish you well.
Well, thank you for having me. It was nice to talk with you.
Thanks.